The question of how empaths can protect themselves from narcissistic abuse is one of the most important psychological challenges we can address. Because the empath narcissist dynamic isn't just about two personality types interacting, it's about a specific relational pattern where one person's extraordinary capacity for empathy becomes weaponized against them by someone whose pathology depends on exploitation. So let's talk about what genuine protection actually looks like. And I want to be very clear from the outset. Protection doesn't mean learning to manipulate better than the narcissist manipulates you. It doesn't mean becoming strategic and calculating in your responses. Real protection comes from something far more fundamental. It comes from developing what I call psychological sovereignty. What do I mean by this? Psychological sovereignty is the state of having such a solid, internally validated sense of self that external manipulation cannot penetrate your core. It's not about building walls or becoming emotionally unavailable. It's about being so grounded in your own reality, your own worth, your own perceptions, that someone else's distortions simply don't have the power to destabilize you. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. The narcissist says something designed to make you question your memory, your perception, your sanity. Classic gaslighting. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. These statements are designed to make you doubt your own experience and defer to their version of reality. The person without psychological sovereignty responds by defending, by trying to prove what happened, by seeking external validation, by doubting themselves. They're operating from a place where the narcissist's opinion of reality holds weight, where proving themselves becomes necessary. But the person with psychological sovereignty has a completely different response. They don't need to defend because they're not seeking the narcissist's agreement about reality. They know what they experienced. They trust their own perception. The narcissist's denial doesn't create doubt. It simply provides information about the narcissist. This might sound like a subtle difference, but it's actually profound. In the first case, the narcissist has power over your internal reality. In the second case, they don't. They can say whatever they want, but it doesn't penetrate. It doesn't create the destabilization they're seeking. And here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't something you perform or strategize. This is something you become through deep internal work. You cannot fake psychological sovereignty. The narcissist will sense immediately if you're performing confidence while still actually seeking their validation underneath. But when you've done the work of genuinely reclaiming your reality, your worth, your perceptions, when you've internalized your own value rather than seeking it externally, the narcissist loses their primary mechanism of control. This is what real protection looks like. Not tactics or strategies to control the narcissist's behavior, but such solid internal grounding that their tactics simply don't work anymore. You're not trying to change them or manage them. You're simply no longer available to be manipulated because you're no longer seeking anything from them that they could withhold. Think about what the narcissist's manipulation depends on. Your need for their approval, your doubt about your own perceptions, your willingness to abandon yourself to maintain the relationship, your fear of their anger or withdrawal, your hope that they'll change. Every single manipulation tactic requires your participation, requires that you still believe they hold something you need. Psychological sovereignty means recognizing, I don't need your approval to know my worth. I don't need your agreement to trust my perceptions. I don't need this relationship to survive. I don't need you to change for me to be okay. And this recognition isn't hostile or bitter. It's simply true. It's the clarity that comes from finally understanding that you've been seeking externally what can only be found internally. And here's what happens when an empath achieves this state. The narcissist's behavior often escalates initially. Because their usual tactics aren't working, they try harder, they push further, they attempt more extreme forms of manipulation. This is actually a sign that your boundaries are working. The narcissist is desperately trying to regain the control they're losing. But if you maintain your sovereignty, if you continue to trust yourself and refuse to abandon your reality for theirs, something shifts. Either the narcissist will eventually move on to easier supply, someone who's still seeking external validation, someone whose reality can still be manipulated, or the relationship will end because it's no longer serving the function it was designed to serve. And this is the crucial point. Genuine protection often means the relationship cannot continue in its current form because the narcissistic relationship was built on your participation in your own diminishment. When you stop participating, when you reclaim your sovereignty, the foundation of the dynamic dissolves. This is very different from trying to win against the narcissist or learning to manipulate them more effectively. This is about becoming so solid in yourself that manipulation stops working. And that solidness either forces the relationship to transform into something healthier, which is rare with true narcissistic pathology, or it makes clear that the relationship must end. Real protection isn't about controlling the narcissist. It's about becoming unmanipulable through the radical act of trusting yourself completely. Now, once you've established that foundation of psychological sovereignty, there's another crucial element of protecting yourself from narcissistic abuse that we need to address. And this one is counterintuitive for most empaths because it goes against every instinct they've developed over a lifetime of prioritizing others' needs. You must learn to recognize and interrupt the trauma bond. Let me be very clear about what a trauma bond is, because this term gets used loosely and often incorrectly. A trauma bond isn't just any difficult or complicated attachment. It's a specific psychological phenomenon where intermittent reinforcement, cycles of abuse, followed by intermittent kindness, attention, or affection, creates a powerful neurochemical addiction to the relationship. And I use the word addiction deliberately because that's what's happening at a neurological level. When the narcissist provides moments of connection, validation, or apparent love after periods of devaluation, your brain releases dopamine and oxytocin. These are the same neurochemicals involved in drug addiction, in gambling addiction, in any compulsive behavior where intermittent rewards create powerful cravings. Here's why this is so insidious for empaths specifically. Empaths are often highly attuned to moments of genuine connection, no matter how brief. They're deeply moved by vulnerability, by glimpses of the wounded person beneath the narcissistic defenses. So, when the narcissist occasionally drops the mask, when they show fear, express need, reveal pain, the empath experiences this as profound intimacy. And after long periods of being devalued, dismissed, or abused, these moments of apparent authenticity feel like water in the desert. The empath's entire being lights up with hope. This is the real them. This is who they could be if they just felt safe enough. This proves the connection we have is real. But what's actually happening is the creation of a trauma bond. The narcissist doesn't need to be kind consistently. In fact, consistency would be far less effective at creating attachment. What creates the bond is the unpredictability, the intermittent reinforcement, the cycle of deprivation, followed by occasional fulfillment. Think about how slot machines work. They're designed with variable ratio reinforcement schedules. You never know when the next payout will come, which makes pulling the lever compulsive. You keep playing because maybe this time, maybe the next pull, maybe if you just stay a little longer, you'll hit the reward. This is exactly what's happening in the trauma-bonded relationship. The empath keeps investing, keeps hoping, keeps trying, because somewhere in their nervous system, they're expecting the next payout, the next moment of connection, the next glimpse of the person they believe the narcissist could be. And here's what makes this so difficult to interrupt. The trauma bond feels like love. It feels like deep connection. It feels like you're seeing something in this person that no one else can see. And if you just hold on, if you just love them enough, if you just understand them deeply enough, they'll be able to become who you know they can be. But this isn't love. This is addiction. And recognizing Indifference is crucial for your protection. Real love involves consistency, reciprocity, respect, and the experience of being seen and valued. Trauma bonds involve anxiety, hypervigilance, constant hope followed by disappointment, and the feeling that you're always trying to earn or recapture something that was briefly given and then withdrawn. So, how do you protect yourself from this? How do you interrupt a trauma bond once you recognize it? First, you have to accept that those moments of apparent connection, the ones that feel so profound, so real, So, like the real them, are part of the pattern, not exceptions to it. They're not glimpses of who the narcissist really is beneath the pathology. They're part of the pathology itself. The intermittent kindness, the occasional vulnerability, the periodic connection. These are the hooks that keep you attached. This is devastatingly difficult for empaths to accept because it means grieving the person you thought was there. It means acknowledging that the connection you felt wasn't what you believed it was. It means facing the possibility that you've been in love with potential, with glimpses, with a phantom, not with a whole, consistent, reciprocal person. Second, you have to create physical and emotional distance. Trauma bonds cannot be interrupted while you're still in regular contact with the person. Your nervous system needs time away from the intermittent reinforcement to begin recalibrating, to start recognizing the pattern for what it is, rather than continuing to hope for the next reward. This is why no contact is often essential for healing from narcissistic abuse. Not because you're being punitive or dramatic, but because your nervous system is literally bonded to this person through cycles of pain and relief, and that bond cannot be broken while the cycles continue. Third, you need to work with your nervous system, not just your cognitive understanding. You can intellectually know that the relationship is harmful, while your body is still craving the person, still lighting up at the thought of contact, still experiencing withdrawal symptoms when they're absent. This requires somatic work, practices that help regulate your nervous system, that teach your body that safety and connection can exist without the anxiety and drama of the trauma bond. Therapy that addresses attachment trauma, body-based practices like yoga or somatic experiencing, anything that helps you feel safe and grounded in your own body rather than constantly seeking regulation through connection with the narcissist. And finally, you have to develop what I call emotional object permanence, the capacity to remember how you feel during the bad times when you're experiencing one of the good moments, and to remember the good moments existed when you're in the bad times. So you can see the full pattern rather than being swept up in whatever the current moment is offering. The empath's protection isn't in learning to manage the narcissist better. It's in learning to recognize when your own neurobiology is working against you, creating attachment to harm. Once you've established psychological sovereignty and begun to recognize and interrupt trauma bonding, there's a third dimension of protection that's equally essential. You must learn to distinguish between compassion and complicity. And this might be the most difficult boundary for empaths to establish, precisely because it requires them to challenge one of their core identities. Empaths pride themselves on their capacity for compassion, their ability to understand suffering, their willingness to see the wounded child beneath someone's harmful behavior. And these are genuinely valuable qualities. The world needs people who can perceive pain, who can hold space for complexity, who refuse to reduce others to their worst moments. But here's what empaths often don't recognize until tremendous damage has been done. There's a crucial difference between having compassion for someone's pain and allowing that compassion to make you complicit in your own mistreatment. Let me be very specific about what this looks like. The narcissist does something harmful, betrays your trust, violates a boundary, says something cruel, and your empathic capacity immediately goes to work understanding why they did it. You think about their childhood trauma, their wounded attachment system, the defenses they developed to survive their own suffering. You recognize that their cruelty comes from pain, that their behavior is a manifestation of deep psychological injury. And all of this might be true, but here's the trap. You use this understanding to excuse the behavior, to talk yourself out of your own legitimate response, to convince yourself that holding them accountable would be unempathetic, that setting a firm boundary would be abandoning someone who's already been abandoned too many times. This is where compassion crosses into complicity. You're not just understanding their pain, you're using your understanding of their pain to justify accepting treatment that harms you. You're allowing your compassion to become a tool that works against your own well-being. And the narcissist, consciously or unconsciously, learns to leverage this. They learn that revealing their wound, expressing their pain, showing their vulnerability, these behaviors will soften your boundaries, will make you question whether you're being too harsh, will activate your empathy in ways that make you back down from consequences. So you find yourself in this exhausting pattern. They harm you, You start to respond with boundaries or consequences. They reveal their pain or their past trauma. And you soften. Your compassion overrides your self-protection. And the harmful pattern continues, now with your full participation under the guise of being understanding. This is not compassion. This is self-abandonment dressed up as empathy. Real compassion can hold two truths simultaneously. I understand why you behave this way, and I will not allow this behavior to continue affecting me. You can have deep empathy for someone suffering and still refuse to be the ongoing recipient of how that suffering manifests. You can recognize that someone is wounded and still maintain that their wound does not give them permission to wound you. The key distinction is this: compassion is something you feel, complicity is something you do. Compassion is an internal state of understanding and care. Complicity is a series of actions or inactions that enable harmful behavior to continue. You can feel compassionate toward the narcissist's developmental trauma while still leaving the relationship. You can understand their pain deeply while refusing to have further contact. You can hold their wounded child in your heart while setting boundaries so firm they effectively end the dynamic. These things are not contradictory. They're the integration of empathy with self-respect. But empaths often struggle with this integration because they've been taught, implicitly or explicitly, that real compassion means staying, enduring, understanding, even at the cost of yourself. They believe that if you truly saw someone's pain, you wouldn't add to it by leaving or setting harsh boundaries. They feel that maintaining consequences in the face of someone's vulnerability is cruel. This is a profound misunderstanding of both compassion and boundaries. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're information. They're clear communication about what you will and won't accept, what you will and won't participate in. And maintaining boundaries in the face of someone's pain isn't cruelty. It's refusing to teach them that expressing pain is an effective way to avoid accountability. In fact, the most compassionate thing you can do for someone with narcissistic pathology is refuse to participate in the patterns that keep them trapped. When you continually soften boundaries in response to their pain, you're inadvertently reinforcing that their wound is a tool they can use to avoid facing the consequences of their behavior. You're helping them stay stuck in their pathology. True compassion sometimes looks like firmness, like unwavering boundaries, like consequences that aren't rescinded when tears appear or trauma is revealed. This doesn't mean you stop caring about their pain. It means you recognize that your continued participation in their harmful patterns is not actually helping them and is certainly destroying you. And here's what's crucial for empaths to understand. You can have compassion for someone without making their healing your responsibility. You can recognize their suffering without becoming the person who absorbs it, manages it, makes themselves smaller to accommodate it. The narcissist's healing, if it's ever going to happen, requires them to face the full reality of how their behavior affects others, to sit with the consequences of their actions, to do the painful internal work that can't be done as long as someone else is buffering them from the impact of their choices. Your compassionate accommodation doesn't help them heal. It prevents them from encountering the discomfort that might finally motivate change. So protecting yourself as an empath means developing what I call boundaried compassion, the capacity to hold someone's pain in your awareness while refusing to sacrifice yourself to it. It means understanding that you can care deeply about someone and still see who's yourself, that you can see their wound and still enforce consequences, that you can recognize their suffering while refusing to let that suffering become justification for your own. This is perhaps the hardest lesson for empaths to learn, that the most compassionate thing you can do is sometimes to stop being compassionate in ways that enable harm. Compassion without boundaries isn't kindness. It's participation in a system that destroys you while teaching the other person that their pain exempts them from accountability. Now we arrive at what might be the most powerful form of protection available to the empath, and it's one that requires no interaction with the narcissist at all. It's purely internal, yet its effects are profound. You must cultivate what I call radical self-validation. This means developing the capacity to know your own worth, trust your own perceptions, and validate your own experience independent of any external confirmation. And for empaths who've been in relationships with narcissists, this is revolutionary because the entire dynamic has been built on the narcissist being the arbiter of reality. Let me explain what I mean. In a narcissistic relationship, there's an implicit but powerful hierarchy of whose perception counts as truth. The narcissist presents their version of reality with such conviction, such certainty, such unwavering confidence that it becomes the dominant narrative. And the empath, with their capacity for self-doubt and their tendency to consider multiple perspectives, begins to defer to this certainty. Did that conversation really go the way I remember? They seem so sure it didn't. Maybe I'm misremembering. Maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am overreacting. This internal dialogue becomes habitual, automatic. You begin checking your perceptions against the narcissist's version before trusting your own. Their reality BK. Ohms more real than yours. And this is where enormous damage occurs. Because when you consistently invalidate your own experience in favor of someone else's narrative, you lose connection to yourself. You lose access to your own inner compass, your own knowing, your own truth. You become dependent on external validation to know what's real. And the person providing that validation is someone who has a vested interest in distorting your reality. So, radical self-validation means reclaiming authority over your own experience. It means developing the capacity to say, I know what I felt, I know what I heard, I know what happened, and I don't need anyone else's agreement to trust that knowing. This sounds simple, but for empaths recovering from narcissistic relationships, it's extraordinarily difficult because you've been trained methodically and persistently to doubt yourself. Every time you raised a concern and were told you were imagining things, every time you expressed hurt and were told you were too sensitive, every time you remembered an event and were told it never happened, these experiences accumulated into a deep uncertainty about your own perceptions. And the narcissist didn't just attack your perception of external events. They attacked your perception of your internal experience. You're not really hurt. You're not actually angry. You don't really feel that way. You're being dramatic. You're being manipulative. They claimed authority not just over what happened, but over what you felt about what happened. This is a profound violation of psychological boundaries, and recovering from it requires rebuilding trust in yourself from the ground up. So what does radical self-validation look like in practice? It means noticing when you have an experience, an emotion, a perception, a reaction, and staying with it, not immediately questioning it, not rushing to explain it away, not checking it against what someone else might think, just acknowledging, this is what I'm experiencing right now. It means when someone tells you your perception is wrong, you can consider their perspective without abandoning your own. You can think, that's their experience, without automatically concluding that their experience invalidates yours. Two people can have genuinely different experiences of the same event. That doesn't mean one is lying or confused. It means they're different people with different perspectives. But here's what the narcissist couldn't tolerate: the idea that your perspective could be equally valid to theirs. They needed your reality to bend to accommodate theirs, because their fragile sense of self couldn't withstand disagreement or difference. Radical self-validation means you no longer participate in that bargain. You no longer sacrifice your reality to maintain someone else's comfort. You trust what you know, what you felt, what you experienced. Not arrogantly, not with the rigid certainty the narcissist displayed, but with the quiet confidence that comes from being grounded in yourself. And here's what happens when you develop this capacity. The narcissist's primary tool for manipulation stops working, because gaslighting only works if you're uncertain enough about your own perception that you'll accept someone else's version instead. When you're solidly rooted in your own knowing, when you've rebuilt trust in your perceptions through consistent self-validation, the narcissist's attempts to distort reality simply bounce off. They can say whatever they want about what happened, about what you felt, about what's real, but it doesn't penetrate because you're no longer looking to them to confirm your experience. You're the authority on your own internal world, and no one else gets to tell you what you felt or didn't feel, what experienced or didn't experience. This is profoundly liberating. And it's also deeply threatening to the narcissist, which is why developing radical self-validation often precipitates either the end of the relationship or an escalation of the narcissist's attempts to destabilize you. Because if they can't control your perception of reality, they've lost their primary mechanism of control. But here's what's important. This isn't about being oppositional or defensive. This isn't about stubbornly clinging to your version of events out of pride. Radical self-validation is quiet, internal, grounded. It's simply trusting yourself the way you've been taught to trust others. It's giving your own perceptions the same weight and credibility you've always given to external authorities. And it requires daily practice, especially in the beginning, because you're working against years of conditioning that taught you to doubt yourself. So you practice noticing your experience without immediately questioning it. You practice trusting your gut, even when you can't fully articulate why. You practice saying, "This is what I know to be true for me," without needing to convince anyone else. Over time, this becomes your foundation. Your reality becomes sovereign, not in an isolated, defensive way, but in a grounded, solid way. You're not cutting yourself off from others' perspectives. You're simply no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection with people who demand you do so. The most powerful protection isn't defending yourself against the narcissist's distortions. It's trusting yourself so completely that those distortions become irrelevant. Building on this foundation of self-validation, there's a fifth dimension of protection that becomes accessible to empaths who've done the deeper work. And this one fundamentally shifts the power dynamic in ways that the narcissist cannot count. It's what I call strategic transparency with emotional detachment. Now, I want to be very careful about how I frame this, because it might sound manipulative, and that's not what I'm describing. This isn't about game playing or tactical maneuvering. This is about reaching a level of clarity about the dynamic that allows you to interact with the narcissist, when interaction is unavoidable, from a place of complete emotional separation. Let me explain what I mean. Most empaths, especially early in their awareness of narcissistic dynamics, try to hide their understanding. They see the manipulation, they recognize the patterns, but they don't name them directly. They hope that if they just set better boundaries, if they just communicate more clearly, if they just show the narcissist how their behavior is affecting them, something will change. But this approach keeps the empath in a position of hoping, of trying, of investing emotional energy in the possibility of change. And that investment is exactly what gives the narcissist continued access to your emotional world. Strategic transparency is different. It's when you've reached a point where you can see the narcissist's behavior clearly, name it accurately, and do so without any emotional charge, without any expectation of change, without any investment in their response. This might look like calmly saying, "I notice you're using deflection right now to avoid addressing what I just said," not as an accusation or an attempt to make them acknowledge their behavior, but simply as an observation. You're not trying to change them or get them to see themselves differently. You're just accurately naming what's happening, the way you might comment on the weather. Or it might look like responding to a manipulation attempt with, "I understand you're trying to make me feel guilty for having this boundary. That's not going to work. Okay." And then simply maintaining the boundary without further explanation or defense. The key element here is the emotional detachment. You're not saying these things from a place of anger, hurt, or vindication. You're not trying to punish or expose them. You're simply operating from such clarity about the dynamic that you can see it and name it without being emotionally hooked by it. And here's why this is so profoundly protective. The narcissist's manipulation depends on your emotional reactivity. They need you to defend yourself, to explain yourself, to become upset, to seek their understanding, to try to make them see reason. All of that emotional energy is supply. All of that investment gives them power and keeps you engaged in a dynamic that drains you. But when you can see their tactics clearly and name them without emotional involvement, something remarkable happens. The manipulation stops working because you're not responding the way you're supposed to. You're not getting defensive, not getting upset, not trying to convince them of anything. You're just observing the pattern and continuing to act in your own interest, regardless of their response. This creates a kind of psychological immunity. It's like you've developed antibodies to their particular form of manipulation. You recognize it when it's happening, you can identify it accurately, and it no longer triggers the emotional response it once did. But I want to emphasize again, this is not a tactic you can fake. If you're trying to perform detachment while actually still being emotionally invested, the narcissist will sense it immediately. This only works when you've genuinely reached a place of emotional separation, when you truly don't need them to understand, don't need them to change, don't need them to validate your reality. This is why strategic transparency is something that typically emerges later in the healing journey. It requires all the previous steps: psychological sovereignty, understanding trauma bonds, boundaried compassion, and radical self-validation. You have to have done the internal work that allows you to see clearly without being destabilized by what you see. And when you reach this place, you might notice something interesting. Your interactions with the narcissist become almost boring. Where they once felt charged, dramatic, emotionally intense, they now feel predictable and somewhat tedious. You can see the patterns so clearly that there's no surprise, no mystery, no hope that this time might be different. This boredom is actually a sign of health. It means you're no longer emotionally invested in the dynamic. You're no longer getting pulled into the drama, no longer hoping for different outcomes, no longer trying to make the relationship something it can never be. And from this place of clarity and detachment, you can make choices about your level of engagement that are based purely on practical considerations rather than emotional entanglement. If you share children with the narcissist, if you work together, if there are practical reasons why complete no contact isn't possible, you can maintain whatever minimal interaction is necessary without it destabilizing your emotional well-being. You're interacting with them the way you might interact with You don't expect the storm to understand how it affects you. You just adapt your behavior to protect yourself from its impact. This is very different from the emotional warfare that characterizes most narcissistic relationships, where both parties are constantly reacting to each other, constantly trying to control or change the other, constantly emotionally activated. Strategic transparency with emotional detachment is what it looks like when one person has completely stepped out of that warfare. You're no longer a participant in the dynamic. You're an observer who occasionally has to navigate through it, but who is no longer defined by it or controlled by it. And perhaps most importantly, this protects you from one of the narcissist's most effective tools, their ability to make you doubt whether you're seeing things clearly. Because when you can name what's happening accurately and without emotional charge, you're demonstrating to yourself that you do see clearly, that your perceptions are accurate, that you're not the confused or crazy person the narcissist would like you to believe you are. The moment you can see the manipulation clearly and feel nothing but mild recognition, you've moved beyond its reach. And now we arrive at the final and perhaps most complete form of protection available to the empath, one that integrates everything we've discussed and transcends the need for ongoing defensive strategies. It's what I call radical acceptance without rescue. This is the state where you can see the narcissist completely, all their pain, all their pathology, all their wounded humanity, and feel genuine compassion for their suffering, while simultaneously having absolute clarity that their healing is not your responsibility and that you cannot save them, no matter how much you care. Let me explain why this is the ultimate form of protection. Throughout this discussion, we've talked about sovereignty, about interrupting trauma bonds, about boundaried compassion, about self-validation, about strategic transparency. All of these are crucial steps, but many empaths, even after implementing all of these protective measures, still carry something: the hope that somehow, if they could just find the right approach, the narcissist might heal. This hope is the last thread keeping empaths tethered to relationships that have already ended emotionally. It's the voice that says, but what if they could change with the right support? What if I'm abandoning them right when they need someone most? What if my leaving prevents them from ever getting the help they need? Radical acceptance without rescue means finally releasing this hope, not from bitterness or cynicism, but from clarity about what is actually possible and what is not. Here's what this looks like in its full form. You can acknowledge that the narcissist's behavior stems from deep developmental trauma, from attachment wounds, from a fragmented sense of self that causes them genuine suffering. You can recognize that they didn't choose to develop this way, that their pathology is a survival adaptation to circumstances that were once overwhelming. You can even feel authentic sadness for the wounded child they once were, and in some ways still are. And simultaneously, you can recognize with complete clarity that you cannot heal them, that your love, your understanding, your patience, your willingness to see their potential, none of it has the power to repair what was broken long before you arrived. That staying in relationship with them doesn't help them. It often enables them to avoid facing the consequences of their behavior that might, someday, motivate them toward actual change. This is acceptance in its deepest form. Not acceptance of abuse, not acceptance of mistreatment, but acceptance of reality. This person has a serious psychological condition that will not change because you love them well enough or understand them deeply enough. Their healing, if it ever happens, will require work that only they can do, and most people with narcissistic pathology never do that work. This acceptance is profoundly liberating because it releases you from the impossible burden of yawning to save someone who hasn't chosen to save themselves. It allows you to grieve, to genuinely mourn the person you hoped they could become, the relationship you wanted to have, the future you imagined together. And grief, when it's complete, leads to release. But here's the crucial element that makes this truly protective, rather than just another form of detachment. Radical acceptance includes accepting yourself exactly as you are, including your empathic nature. You're not trying to become less empathic, less compassionate, less capable of deep feeling. You're not hardening yourself or building walls around your heart. Instead, you're becoming more discerning about where you direct that empathy, more selective about who deserves access to your extraordinary capacity for understanding, more protective of your gifts by ensuring they're offered to people who can actually receive them and reciprocate in healthy ways. This is very different from the shutdown that sometimes happens after narcissistic abuse, where empaths try to suppress their empathic capacity because it's caused them so much pain. That suppression creates different problems. It's self-abandonment of a different kind, where you're rejecting the core of who you are because it was exploited. Radical acceptance means you keep your empathic gifts fully intact while developing the wisdom to know when and where and with whom to share them. You remain capable of deep compassion while being completely clear about your limitations and boundaries. You can care deeply about someone's suffering while maintaining that their suffering doesn't obligate you to suffer alongside them. And here's what makes this the most complete form of protection. When you reach this state, you're no longer vulnerable to the narcissist's primary tools of manipulation. They can't guilt you because you've accepted that choosing yourself is to abandonment. It's necessary self-preservation. They can't manipulate your hope because you've released the hope that they'll change. They can't destabilize you with their version of reality because you firmly validated your own. But perhaps most importantly, you're also not vulnerable to your own self-doubt, your own guilt, your own tendency to wonder if you could have done more, loved better, understood more deeply, because you've accepted genuinely, completely, that you gave what you could give, and it wasn't a failure of your love that the relationship couldn't work. It was a mismatch between what you needed and what they could provide, between healthy relational patterns and pathological ones. This acceptance creates what might seem like a paradox. You're completely done fighting, completely done trying, completely done hoping, and from that place of complete release, you're finally truly free. Not free in the way you might have imagined, where the narcissist changes and the relationship is magically healed, but free in a deeper way, free from the burden of believing you could save them, free from the guilt of choosing yourself, free from the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. And this freedom is available regardless of whether you maintain any contact with the narcissist or not, because it's not dependent on their behavior or their response. It's an internal state of clarity and peace that you've cultivated through accepting reality exactly as it is, including the reality that you cannot rescue anyone who hasn't chosen to rescue themselves, no matter how much you care. This is where the journey of protecting yourself from narcissistic abuse completes itself, not by becoming less loving, but by loving yourself enough to stop participating in your own diminishment. The ultimate protection isn't learning to defend against the narcissist. It's accepting that some people cannot be saved, and your life's purpose is not to keep trying.